I've never felt like this before. It's like you just get me. I feel like my true self with you. Does that sound crazy? And it doesn't hurt that you're gorgeous. Okay, that's it. I'm taking you home with me. I mean, you can't find shoes this good just anywhere. Find a shoe for every you from brands you love, like Birkenstock, Nike, Adidas, and more at your DSW store or dsw.com.
This message comes from Capital One. The Capital One Venture X Business Card has no preset spending limit, so the card's purchasing power can adapt to meet business needs. Plus, the card earns unlimited double miles on every purchase, so the more a business spends, the more miles earned. And when traveling, the Venture X Business Card grants access to over 1,000 airport lounges. The Venture X Business Card. What's in your wallet? Terms and conditions apply. Find out more at CapitalOne.com/VentureXBusiness.
Hey everyone, Sebastian here. Before we get started today, I wanted everyone listening to know that today's episode is going to be dealing with a number of very difficult topics. We're going to be discussing sexual assault, suicide, and violence of all sorts. Please use your discretion when it comes to how and when you listen to this show. If you're listening with younger people, just be advised that there are some tough moments. All right, for everybody else, I hope you enjoy the show. It always seems strange to me that Christopher Columbus became so deeply wrapped up in the national mythology of the United States of America. Doesn't necessarily seem intuitive that a country whose identity is so deeply linked to violently breaking away from its European colonial masters and rejecting monarchy would gravitate towards a figure like Columbus. After all, Christopher Columbus was a representative of the Spanish crown. The man was nothing if not a devoted monarchist. His exploits in the Caribbean were all about expanding a European empire and enriching his royal patrons. With the notable exception of the island of Puerto Rico, Columbus never set foot on any piece of land that would become part of the United States. Also, consider how in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, American rhetoric was so deeply anti-Spanish. Barely a decade after drafting the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson suggested that the United States might want to gobble up Latin America, quote, piece by piece, end quote. A few years later, John Adams casually slammed everyone living in South America, calling them, quote, a people more ignorant, more bigoted, more superstitious, more implicitly credulous in the sanctity of royalty, more blindly devoted to their priests than any people in Europe, end quote. Clearly, the so-called founding fathers of the United States carried some serious prejudices when it came to Latin America. In their mind, Latin America was the worse America. In keeping with these prejudices, many Spanish colonial figures were either ignored or were presented as unambiguously villainous in the United States. The notable exception was, of course, Christopher Columbus. Which raises the question, why? Why celebrate Columbus despite his deep connection to the Spanish crown and the Spanish presence in the Americas? Well, first of all, it helped that Columbus was not himself Spanish. Some American commentators also like to underscore the fact that Columbus's home city of Genoa had technically been a republic during its late medieval heyday. The fact that Columbus never seemed particularly enthused about Genoa's brand of republicanism was beside the point. There were just enough convenient historical facts so that Columbus could be presented as a decidedly non-Spanish Renaissance man who hailed from a republic. Hey, just like the young United States. But the scholar Elise Bartosik-Velez makes an even more compelling case for why Columbus's memory was so enthusiastically embraced by Americans, especially in the early to mid-19th century. She argues that Columbus's voyages were written about and publicly commemorated in a way that made them analogous to one of the foundational Western myths. This was the story of the Trojan Aeneas, his flight from the burning city of Troy, and his establishment of a new empire on the Italian peninsula. This story was immortalized in the epic poem The Aeneid, written by the famous Roman poet Virgil during the reign of the first Roman emperor, Augustus. The poem was, at least in part, a form of Augustan propaganda, meant to add a deep mythological legitimacy to the first emperor's reign. One of the central ideas in the Aeneid was that by landing in Italy, overcoming the warring kingdoms who resisted him, and establishing a new noble society, Aeneas had transported Trojan civilization to a new home base further west. Everything that was considered great about Troy, and by extension Bronze Age Aegean society, now had a new home in Italy. The message was that Rome was now the center of the world. Anything good about the East had been brought west, and there, in Italy, it had found an even greater expression, first in Aeneas's new settlement, and then finally in Rome under the Emperor Augustus. This narrative of imperial legitimacy being passed to the West from the East even has a fancy Latin name, Translatio Imperii. Elise Bartosik-Velez has argued that the narrative of Translatio Imperii was also used to frame the exploits of Christopher Columbus. Columbus himself hinted at this idea in his own accounts of the first voyage to the Caribbean. One of the earliest historians of Columbus's voyages, a man known as Peter Martyr, would explicitly compare Columbus to Aeneas in his influential history of the early Spanish colonial era. The idea was that, like Aeneas, Columbus had traveled west, bringing with him all the good of the civilization birthed in the East. Like Aeneas, he was justified in overcoming the local powers that be so as to establish something greater. Or at least, so went the story. This idea was later seized on by some Americans, first to legitimize their newly independent republic, and then to justify the nation's expansion across the continent. The myth of Translatio Imperii could easily be applied to the creation of the United States. Many Americans were attracted to the idea that Columbus's voyages had not only imported European society to the Western Hemisphere, but like Aeneas, Columbus had created a new Western headquarters for capital C civilization. In this analogy, Europe was Troy, the old but fallen home of civilization, and America was Rome, the new glorious home of quote-unquote Western Empire. Columbus was America's Aeneas. In this sense, the details of Columbus's life and voyages were unimportant beyond the basic fact that he had come west, and by his very presence transferred power and legitimacy from the old world to the new. In America, Columbus mattered more as a mythological symbol than he did as a historical figure. This vision of the American Columbus was perhaps best articulated in a statue that stood beside the steps of the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. from 1844 to 1958. The statue was called The Discovery of America and displayed Columbus in all of his mythological glory, welcoming those who would enter the halls of American power. The mariner stood triumphant in full armor, holding a globe aloft above his head. To his right stood an indigenous woman, represented as 2/3 the size of the European, wearing only a loincloth, crouching defensively and looking up at Columbus in awe. Not only did the Discovery of America sculpture explicitly propagate the myth that Columbus was the first person to prove that the world was round, but it also sent a very clear message about how European settlers of that era felt about America's First Nations. Indigenous society, represented by the cowering woman, was lesser than Euro-American society, represented by Columbus. A few years later, this statue was paired with a somehow less subtle sculpture depicting the European conquest of North America. Titled The Rescue, this sculpture depicted a giant European frontiersman overpowering a much smaller tomahawk-wielding indigenous warrior who was attacking the frontiersman's family. In the sculpture, the ridiculously large European restrains the warrior without much trouble and looks down upon the man with pity in his eyes. The message is as blatant as it gets. Native people are violent and savage, and Europeans have a duty to pacify them. And just in case people didn't get the message, the sculptor, Horatio Greenborough, went on record saying that the statue was meant to convey, quote, the idea of the triumph of the whites over the savage tribes, end quote. These two statues, the Discovery and the Rescue, flanked the stairway to the United States Capitol, a location that suggested that these statues told the story of America. Even in the 1930s, many Americans looked at these statues and thought that their racist themes were unseemly. In 1939, a joint resolution was presented to the American Congress that declared that these sculptures should be, quote, ground into dust and scattered to the four winds, that no more remembrance may be perpetuated of our barbaric past, and that it may not be a constant reminder to our American Indian citizens, end quote. I'll say it again. That resolution was from 1939. Now, that resolution would not pass the House of Representatives. It would take nearly 20 more years before the statues were removed. Still, I think it's notable that in 1958, both the Discovery of America and the Rescue were unceremoniously transported from the steps of the Capitol into a Smithsonian storage facility. 1958. A year when segregation was still the law of the land in many states, and the civil rights movement was just starting to gain momentum. In that year, enough people found those statues objectionable that they were whisked away and hidden from sight. The story that many people wanted to tell about America was clearly changing. And yet, the story that many people want to tell about Columbus has remained stubbornly consistent. To this day, you can find many Columbus apologists arguing that while the mariner was hardly perfect, he still deserves to be regarded as a great man. Writers also can't help but invoke classical mythological tropes when discussing the mariner. In a 2013 piece defending the continued celebration of Columbus Day in the United States, American historian William J. Connell wrote that the best classical parallel for Columbus was not Aeneas, but Oedipus, the mythical king of Thebes who unwittingly killed his father and bedded his mother, not knowing their true identities. Connell called Columbus the, quote, Oedipus of world history, end quote, writing, quote, he solved the riddle of the Atlantic trade winds, making him a hero, but the diseases he brought to America, the resulting demographic collapse, and the importation of slaves from Africa turned him into a murderer, end quote. He would later continue saying, quote, but there is a difference between responsibility and guilt. Oedipus was responsible for the death of his father and for sleeping with his mother, but was he guilty? End quote. His point was that Columbus, like Oedipus, caused many evil things to happen, But also, like the mythical hero, he did not intend to do the evil. This version of the Columbus story is the one that I really want to investigate today. Connell, like many defenders of the Columbian legacy, concede that the explorer set a series of events in motion that led to a disaster, but that he did this unwittingly. To borrow a phrase from Connell, the proposition is that he bears some responsibility, but not the guilt. Today, I want to test that proposition. Perhaps it is unfair to blame Columbus for all the excesses and atrocities committed as part of the centuries-long colonial project in the Americas and beyond. But what about Columbus's actual decisions? What about the way that he chose to administer his ad hoc empire in the Caribbean? What of the terrible fate of the indigenous islanders known to the Spanish as the Taínos and the Caribs? If it's unfair to hold Columbus responsible for centuries of pandemic disease and colonial violence that came in his wake, surely we can evaluate him based on his own actions during his lifetime. After all, Columbus would eventually find himself transported back to Spain in chains to answer for his conduct in the New World. If the people of the 16th century thought he deserved to stand trial for his actions, why can't we be just as critical here in the 21st century? How does the story of Christopher Columbus end? Let's find out today on Our Fake History. Episode number 180, Columbus, Part 3. Hello and welcome to Our Fake History. My name is Sebastian Major, and this is the podcast where we explore historical myths and try to determine what's fact, what's fiction, and what is such a good story it simply must be told. Before we get going this week, I just want to remind everyone listening that an ad-free version of this podcast is available through Patreon. Go to patreon.com/OurFakeHistory and get an ad-free version of this podcast with a ton of other extras as well, including an upcoming extra episode that will be jam-packed with things I wasn't able to fit in this Columbus series. So if you are enjoying this series on Christopher Columbus and you want more, well, now is an excellent time to start supporting the show through Patreon. Now, let's say you are digging the show, but you don't have extra cash to support. I get it. I understand how it is out there. If that's you, it would be amazing if you could leave a 5-star review of this show on Apple Podcasts or on any other app that allows you to review shows. That Apple Podcast rating can really make a difference for the show. So if you are enjoying what you're hearing, you want to support the show, Patreon isn't in the budget, then a 5-star rating and some kind words would really go a long way. And it would make you a beautiful human being. This week, we are concluding our series on Christopher Columbus. As you've hopefully already put together, this is part 3 in a 3-part series on the famous Genoese mariner. If you've not heard the first 2 parts of this series, then I strongly suggest that you go back and give them a listen now. In part 1, I tried to properly frame the historical controversy that swirls around the memory of Columbus. We went through his early life and career as a merchant seaman in Genoa, his move to Portugal, and the development of his idea to sail west in hopes of finding Asia. Along the way, I threw some cold water on the idea that Columbus was a revolutionary man of science, whose voyages proved that he was right all along about the size and shape of the world. On the contrary, his voyages demonstrated just how wrong he had been. In part 2 of this series, we spent most of our time focusing on Columbus's first voyage to the Caribbean in 1492. I discussed Columbus's habit of lying, cheating, and revising history in order to better buttress his reputation and exaggerate the value of the islands he had encountered. I tried to give Columbus his due for being a truly talented sailor who found his way to the Caribbean almost entirely on instinct. However, we also looked critically at Columbus's first encounters with the indigenous people of the Caribbean. In his journal, he almost immediately took stock of those people and determined that he could easily enslave them and exploit their lands. We also looked at how the first voyage nearly fell apart after the Pinta defected and the Santa Maria was shipwrecked. However, Columbus spun this near disaster into a success by using the remains of the Santa Maria to build a crude fort on the island of Hispaniola that he dubbed Navidad. There, he left 39 crewmen. This allowed him to return to Spain, claiming that his voyage had in fact exceeded expectations. Not only had he sailed to the Indies, but he had also established a Spanish colony on the doorstep of what was surely the Asian mainland. This was an exaggeration, to say the least. The gambit worked, though. When he returned to Spain, Columbus was given a hero's welcome, and news of his successful voyage quickly spread all over Europe. Further, a second voyage was quickly organized to both relieve the men of Navidad and make good on Columbus's promises of easy riches and plentiful gold on the islands of the Indies. However, before the much larger second expedition set sail in September of 1493, Columbus and the Spanish monarchs renewed and revised their agreement with one another. Columbus had all of his new titles, including Admiral of the Ocean Sea and Viceroy of the Indies, reaffirmed and made hereditary, so he could pass them on to his descendants. He was also guaranteed 1/8 of all the gold or other spoils that he might acquire on the second voyage. But one of the notable additions were new directives from the monarchs concerning the treatment of the people who currently lived on what they believed were the islands of the Indies. The monarchs were very interested in the conversion of those people to Christianity, but otherwise, they saw the indigenous people of those islands as new subjects who should be treated with a modicum of respect and dignity. The monarchs explicitly commanded Columbus to, quote, force and compel all who sailed with him to treat the Indians very well and lovingly, and abstain from doing them any injury, end quote. Further, Columbus was to, quote, graciously present them with things from the merchandise of their highnesses and honor them much, end quote. Further, Columbus was to, quote, punish severely, end quote, any member of his crew who mistreated the native people of the islands. Now, this, I think, is significant. The Spanish monarchs did not call for these territories to be violently subjugated, nor did they want the institution of a Caribbean slave trade. They explicitly said in writing that the people of the Indies should be treated kindly and fairly. They should be won over with gifts. Now, I don't want to give the impression that Ferdinand and Isabella were somehow model humanitarians. They had no problem violently subjugating people. Their treatment of the Spanish Jews alone is enough to earn them the judgment of history, but that's a topic for another day. But in this case, I think you could argue that they should not be blamed for what happened to the indigenous people of the Caribbean. Columbus wasn't just following orders, to borrow a phrase. In fact, his treatment of the people of the islands was often directly in violation of the wishes of the Spanish monarchs. And a quick word on that term Indians that popped up in the quote I just read. Columbus had started calling the people he encountered on the islands Indians on his first voyage. This misnomer was, of course, just another bit of Columbus marketing. Remember, he was trying to convince the world that he had found Asia or the Indies. So the people he encountered must therefore be Indians, or Indios, as he called them in his journal. The fact that this misnomer persisted long after it was clear that Columbus had not reached the Indies and was then haphazardly applied to every human being from every culture in all of North and South America is, in my opinion, one of the more bizarre things that has happened in human history. Now, I'm aware that some indigenous people have reclaimed the term Indian, and some even self-identify as Indians. Remember, in the first part of this series, I mentioned the American Indian movement. However, many other indigenous folks have rejected it as a harmful colonial term. I will leave that debate to First Nation folks. But still, to misidentify the population of two massive continents and then have that misidentification stick? Yowza. Now, as you've probably already guessed, as today's episode progresses, we're going to be getting deeper into Columbus's many misdeeds. His second and third voyages to the Caribbean would prove to be the most disastrous in terms of loss of life and human suffering. But before I wade into that too deeply, I think I need to say something about the so-called Black Legend of the Spanish. When evaluating the early Spanish colonial era, it's worth considering that our perception of that time may be colored by a tradition of anti-Spanish propaganda that has been called broadly the Black Legend. The Black Legend has its roots in the Dutch struggle for independence from the Spanish crown in the 16th century. At the time, Dutch rebels had an interest in presenting the Spanish as especially vile and oppressive. As such, particularly brutal episodes from the Spanish conquests of the previous century were circulated alongside provocative woodcuts depicting these violent moments. Tales of Spanish cruelty in the early colonies were usually paired with descriptions of torture from the Spanish Inquisition to create an impression that the Spanish were particularly evil. These negative depictions of the Spanish were embraced in many Protestant parts of Europe, as they fit a larger Reformation narrative about how inherently evil the Catholic faith was. The Black Legend eventually became quite popular in England, where it was often employed to justify the English colonial project. English imperialism could be presented as even-handed, sober, and quite reasonable compared to the Black Legend of the capricious, bloodthirsty Spanish. And this is the real problem with the Black Legend. It's an example of historical whataboutism. It's a type of rhetorical cover that could be used by other colonizers. Let's say you're critical of the British Empire. Well, a defender could always say, well, what about the Spanish? I understand why many Spanish people are still sensitive about the Black Legend to this day, because this idea has died hard. For instance, when researching this series, I read a well-known history by Hans Koenig called Columbus, His Enterprise, Exploding the Myth. Published originally in 1976, this book was meant as an antidote to the overwhelmingly heroic image of Columbus that was still common in American history classes at that time. Now, even this book, which presented itself as a hard-nosed, even polemical takedown of the Columbus myth, sometimes dips into the Black Legend. I'll give you an example. In one passage, Koenig acidly describes the slothful conduct of the Spanish aristocrats who followed Columbus west on his second voyage. Koenig writes, quote, "If you compare their helplessness with the self-reliance of, say, the French fishermen or the English fur traders in the north, the difference is almost too enormous to understand. But this hatred, or at best disdain for their surroundings, this gangster mentality of the Spanish conquistadors, goes part way to explaining their inhumanity, both towards the inhabitants of the land they conquered and towards each other." End quote. I mean, there it is, in 1976, the Black Legend, where the English and French colonizers are presented as admirably self-reliant. The Spanish are nothing but cruel, lazy, and inhuman. This is a characterization that needs to be resisted. But, with all of that said, that doesn't mean that the incidences exploited by the enemies of the Spanish in the creation of the Black Legend didn't happen. In questioning the Black Legend, we shouldn't then overcorrect by ignoring very real, well-documented instances of violence and exploitation in the Spanish colonies. These things did happen and were recorded by a multiplicity of sources. We need to recognize those historical facts while not then leaning into the idea that violence, exploitation, and cruelty are somehow exclusively Catholic or Spanish traits. Sadly, no one nation or ethnic group has a monopoly on cruelty. By the same token, the excesses of other colonial regimes should not be pish-poshed away because, what about the Spanish? So, I'm going to do my best not to indulge in the Black Legend, while also trying to be as real as I possibly can about the humanitarian disasters caused by Columbus's regime on the islands of the Caribbean. You can be the judge of how well I walk that line. Okay, so let's catch up with Columbus and his fleet of 17 ships on his second journey across the Atlantic in the fall of 1493. Christopher Columbus's activities in the Caribbean from the autumn of 1493 to the spring of 1496 usually get referred to as the Second Voyage. But this can give the slightly misleading impression that Columbus was at sea voyaging for most of that time, when in reality there were long stretches when Columbus was firmly encamped on the island of Hispaniola, that is, modern Haiti and the Dominican Republic. The second voyage was just as much about putting down roots and conquering islands already encountered as it was finding a route to the Asian mainland. The second voyage was also characterized by Columbus losing control of the narrative that he had so carefully constructed after the first voyage. Remember, Columbus could be like a startup CEO, a pitchman who never stopped pitching. After the first voyage, he had promised folks back in Spain easy wealth, islands filled with gold, and a local population who would gladly give over all they had to the Spanish. It was long before the over 1,500 people that Columbus had brought along with him on the second voyage were able to see for themselves that the admiral had been exaggerating. With that many new eyewitnesses, keeping a lid on that story would prove difficult. In my opinion, it was Columbus's desperate attempts to keep his illusory vision of the Indies alive and demonstrate a return on investment that led to his worst atrocities. Using the trade winds that Columbus had identified on the first voyage, the fleet of 17 ships crossed the Atlantic quickly and without much incident in 1493. However, on the second voyage, the fleet arrived in the Caribbean at a slightly more southern latitude than they had on the first voyage. This meant that the first sightings of land were not in the Bahamas, but instead in the island chain known as the Lesser Antilles. As Columbus's fleet worked their way north through this island chain towards their ultimate goal of Hispaniola, the admiral, of course, went through his typical ritual of claiming every island he encountered for the Spanish monarchs and giving the territories new names. In this island chain, Columbus and his crew encountered a people that they had only heard rumors about on the first voyage. These were the Kalinago people, who the Spanish would eventually come to call the Caribs. These were the alleged cannibals that Columbus had heard tales of in 1492. Now, like I said, I will be evaluating claims about cannibalism on a forthcoming extra episode for the patrons of this podcast. But what is clear is that in 1493, the Caribs were more likely to greet the Spanish violently than the folks the Spanish were now calling the Taínos further to the north. On Columbus's first voyage, he had reported that the Taíno people were often the victims of Carib raids, and these early encounters on the second voyage seemed to confirm that. Our sources tell us that almost all the encounters between the Kalinago, aka Carib, people in the Lesser Antilles were violent. We're also told that Columbus and his crew liberated many people who had been captured and held hostage by the Caribs. Now, Columbus would use these encounters with the Caribs to justify his presence in the islands and explain his early forays into slave-taking. The Spanish monarchs had commanded him to treat the people of the Indies with love and kindness. Well, Columbus and his supporters would argue that by fighting the Caribs and taking them as hostages, they were acting as the protectors of the Taínos, the folks that they deemed to be the good islanders. One of the first ships to return to Spain from the second voyage had a cargo of enslaved Carib people on board. In a letter to the monarchs, Columbus would insist that these people were being sent to Castile so that they might learn Spanish and give up cannibalism, and then hopefully embrace Christianity. The idea was, at least at the outset, that any human chattel sent back to Spain were prisoners of war who practiced cannibalism. Columbus would insist in his letters that these people were being sent to Europe as much for their own betterment as any profit that might be made from their sale in the slave markets. Now, once again, we know from our primary source documents that the Spanish monarchs never really liked this idea. The first few groups of indigenous people sent back to Spain on Spanish ships had horrible survival rates. If these people managed to survive the voyage, most indigenous folks only lasted a few months in the Iberian Peninsula, usually killed by the European diseases that would soon rock North and South America. In a margin to one letter where Columbus proposed that a robust slave trade of Carib cannibals be established between Spain and the new colonies, the monarchs commented, quote, "You must tell him what happened here with the cannibals that came," end quote. In other words, these people you're sending us, Columbus, are sick and dying. Please stop sending them. In another letter, the monarchs explicitly told Columbus that they would rather that he convert the local people there in the Indies and that he should not send anyone to Spain. Now, I'm underscoring this because it's easy to say that Columbus was a man of his time and that he operated using the moral standards of his day. And that is true. But it's worth remembering that his monarchs told him time and time again that they were not interested in slaves from the Indies. And Columbus kept on insisting on it. Many of those captives liberated from the Caribs also soon learned that their supposed liberators were no better than the people that they had escaped from. In one particularly dramatic instance, a group of indigenous women who had been rescued by Columbus and his crew from a Carib band threw themselves overboard and attempted to swim a solid 2 miles to shore in order to escape their supposed rescuers. Columbus's men chased them down in boats and eventually forced them back onto the ships, which totally sounds like the kind of thing you would do to a people who had been liberated. You see, from almost the outset of the second voyage, we get reports of Columbus's men taking indigenous women as sex slaves. Now, Columbus would later write of his disgust at the immoral, lustful appetites of some of the members of his entourage. However, other sources tell a different story. For example, one of the sailors on the second voyage was a childhood friend of Columbus's named Michele da Cuneo. In his account of the voyage, he describes an episode where, quote, "While I was in the boat, I captured a very beautiful Carib woman, who the said Lord Admiral gave to me," end quote. Cuneo would then go on to describe a very violent rape, the details of which I will spare you from here. I bring this up not to be gratuitous, but to point out that we have many sources, like Cuneo's, that demonstrate that Columbus was actively giving his crew members women as slaves. He was fine with this kind of behavior so long as he signed off on it first. Eventually, the fleet made their way to the island of Hispaniola and the settlement of Navidad, the small fort built from the remains of the Santa Maria, where Columbus had strategically planted 39 sailors from the first expedition. But when they arrived, Columbus and his crew were shocked to discover that Navidad was abandoned and was left in ruins. They soon learned that all 39 of the Spanish sailors had been killed. What had happened here? Columbus had thought that he had left these men under the care of his local ally, the cacique named Guacanagari. When Columbus eventually located Guacanagari looking for answers, he found the cacique laid up, nursing a wound on his leg. The injured man then repeated a story that Columbus had heard from a few different indigenous people that he had already interrogated. Not long after the admiral had departed the island, the 39 men of Navidad started quarreling amongst one another. Soon, order broke down, and the men started conducting improvised raids on their indigenous neighbors, stealing anything they saw as valuable, and, most egregiously, capturing and assaulting local women. Eventually, the people of the island had had enough of this. Now, Guacanagari was not the only cacique on the island, and many of the other leaders were understandably outraged at the conduct of these new visitors. And so, according to Guacanagari, one of the other caciques, a man named Coanabo, led his people in an attack on Navidad, killing every European left behind. Guacanagari claimed that he had tried to defend the Christians and was even wounded fighting alongside them, hence his injured leg. Now, Columbus was skeptical that Guacanagari had actually been wounded defending the Spanish, but he ultimately accepted that the men had been killed as an act of revenge after a haphazard campaign of rape and mayhem. He would later lament that this whole thing could have been avoided if those men had just followed his orders and left the local people alone. These types of laments are very common in Columbus's writing. And in my estimation, Columbus defenders have a habit of taking them at face value. The idea is that Columbus always wanted the best for both the indigenous people of the Caribbean and his own crew, but he was constantly being betrayed by lesser men. And it is true that Columbus had a hard time keeping his subordinates in line, but I don't think everything can be blamed on disobedient underlings. But of course, that's my opinion. With Navidad destroyed, Columbus set about building a new settlement to act as the base of operations on Hispaniola. On January 2nd of 1494, he officially dubbed his new town La Isabela in honor of the queen he served. But over the next few months, life in La Isabela would prove difficult. Despite the reported fecundity of the island, many of the Spanish colonists soon discovered that surviving in a hastily built outpost at the edges of the known world was quite difficult. Columbus would end up scouting into the interior, into a plain known as the Cibao. There he would establish another fort he named Santo Tomas, a nod to the biblical doubting Thomas. The idea being that no one should doubt his reports of huge wealth on Hispaniola. He would return to La Isabela with a characteristically exaggerated report of a region filled with rich gold mines and gold nuggets the size of a man's head that could be found by the riverside. But it wasn't long before the Spanish learned that while the Cibao had some gold in it, it was mostly in the form of alluvial gold. That is, small nuggets and gold dust that can be panned out of the river. In reality, gold mining in the region was incredibly difficult and yielded only small returns. Men who had been sold a get-rich-quick scheme were now feeling dissatisfied and misled. As such, Columbus found it increasingly hard to maintain law and order in La Isabela. So, the admiral resorted to a fairly draconian style of frontier justice to try and keep his colonists in line. Men who had traveled with Columbus would later complain that the admiral was arbitrary and inconsistent in his administering of this justice. He was accused of playing favorites, being completely laissez-faire sometimes, and then inflexibly rigid at others. Corporal punishments like lashings were incredibly common, as were public executions for those deemed to be criminals. Now, even some of Columbus's harshest critics, like the historian Bartolomé Las Casas, would defend him on this count. Las Casas, who would take Columbus to task for his treatment of indigenous people, would write that Columbus was usually justified when punishing the Spanish colonists, and that complaints of the disaffected should not be taken too seriously. He noted that, quote, criminals are always demanding to go unpunished, end quote. Now, does that mean that these people's complaints were completely unjustified? Not necessarily. It's just worth noting that Las Casas believed that maybe they deserved what they got. You can be the judge. Still, what this meant was that by early 1494, various groups of would-be colonists started returning to Spain angry and dissatisfied with the Admiral of the Ocean Sea. Many of these people were well-connected aristocrats who started actively criticizing Columbus at the Spanish court. As more angry colonists returned home, the more an anti-Columbus sentiment started to grow in Spain. But Spain wasn't the only place where anti-Columbus sentiment was growing. In the spring of 1494, reports started coming in from the Cibao gold mining region that the formerly helpful indigenous people were abandoning their posts and were now refusing to aid the Spanish. Coanabo, the cacique who had previously attacked Navidad, was now commanding an alliance of local people set on expelling the Spanish from the interior and eventually the entire island. This prompted Columbus to send one of his captains on the first of what would later become known as pacification missions. That is, violent suppression of indigenous resistance. In April of 1494, Alonso Ojeda and a force of 400 Spaniards overcame a considerably larger force of indigenous warriors in the interior of Hispaniola. The battle would presage many other conflicts between indigenous people and the Spanish over the coming centuries. The steel weapons and, even more significantly, war horses employed by the Spanish would more than make up for their smaller numbers. But on this expedition, Ojeda didn't really distinguish between friendly and hostile groups of people. He would end up capturing 3 local leaders, who he then led back to La Isabela in chains. But also, at one important river crossing that was controlled by a tribe that had been friendly to the Spanish, Ojeda used a rumor that on a previous expedition some clothes had been stolen from the Spanish as a pretense to make a show of force. He occupied the river crossing, captured a number of local people, and then had one unfortunate man taken to the center of a village and had his ears cut off for all to see. When the prisoners arrived at La Isabela, Columbus personally ordered that they should all be publicly beheaded. In the estimation of Bartolomé Las Casas, Ojeda's campaign and Columbus's summary executions were a dark turning point in relations between the Europeans and the first people of the island. In his opinion, from this point on, the two camps were set at odds. He would sarcastically write, quote, "What wonderful news would now be spread the length and breadth of the land concerning the greatness and goodness of these Christians." End quote. Now, Bartolomé Las Casas is an interesting source. His father, Pedro Las Casas, sailed with Columbus on the second voyage and was a first-hand witness of many of the events his son would later write about. Bartolomé Las Casas would migrate to Hispaniola himself in 1502, and his experiences there would make him very sympathetic to the plight of the first people of the island. Now, this perspective makes his histories unique and quite honestly indispensable. But like all writers, he has his biases. You see, Las Casas was also a priest and a devoted missionary. He wanted to convert the people of the islands to the Catholic faith, and he often frames moments of ill treatment as wrong because it hurt the cause of conversion. In the quote above, Las Casas is basically lamenting that these harsh acts of pacification had hurt the reputation of the Christian religion. But more on Las Casas a little later on. This first act of pacification was just the start. Things were about to get considerably worse on Hispaniola. So let's take a break here. And when we come back, we'll see just how dark the Columbus regime would get. In late April 1494, Columbus departed from La Isabela with a small fleet, leaving his brother Diego in charge back on Hispaniola. This time, the admiral was determined to find the Asian mainland, or at least the island of Cipango, his name for Japan. This was not meant to be. He would end up exploring the long southern coast of Cuba and would eventually make his way to the island of Jamaica. Not only was this mission plagued by bad weather and many other hardships, but it was also becoming clear to many that they were not especially close to China. However, Columbus was not ready to give up on that idea. In particular, he was not ready to concede that Cuba was not a Chinese peninsula. At one point on that voyage, he had every member of his crew, including the ship's boys, sign a sworn oath that Cuba was not an island and that they need not keep exploring its coast because it was so clearly a peninsula. Further, anyone who said that Cuba was an island could expect 100 lashes. But after this oath was sworn, Columbus kept encountering and capturing indigenous people who assured him that Cuba was, in fact, an island. This fact even made it into Ferdinand Columbus's very complimentary biography of his father. Even Ferdinand had to admit that Columbus refused to believe the reality of Caribbean geography. Columbus would later point to this sworn oath made by the crewmen to help keep up the illusion that he had created on his first voyage. But the fact that Columbus had to enforce the belief that Cuba was an island with the threat of 100 lashes suggests that many had started to understand that these supposed lands of the Indies were not exactly what Columbus said they were. When the bedraggled group finally returned to Hispaniola in August of 1494, they found the nascent Spanish colony in disarray. Dissatisfied colonists were openly defying Diego Columbus, and like the men of Navidad, many had taken to abusing, stealing from, and sexually assaulting the local people. As such, the goodwill of the once welcoming people of Hispaniola had been completely exhausted. Some groups stood in open rebellion, while others, who were ostensibly still Spanish friends and allies, had become less forthcoming with food, gifts, and even a willingness to trade. This was not good, as Columbus had appearances to keep up back in Spain. He knew that there was a contingent of disaffected former comrades back in Castile telling everyone who would listen that he was an incompetent charlatan. If Hispaniola didn't start producing wealth quickly, everything he had spent his life building could fall apart. So Columbus made a number of fateful decisions that, in my humble opinion, should be carefully considered by anyone trying to evaluate his legacy. First, Columbus started a program of mass enslavement. Historian Lawrence Bergreen has pointed out that Columbus's letters and other primary source documents suggest that Columbus had been openly musing about starting a slave trade as early as February of 1494. This was well before any large-scale violent native resistance took shape. As I mentioned earlier, this trade was to focus only on the supposedly cannibalistic Carib people. But after Columbus's return to Hispaniola in the late summer of 1494, he now became less discerning about exactly who he was forcing into bondage. And so Columbus set about capturing as many people as he possibly could. He captured those he considered Caribs, but also those who he had identified previously as Taínos. He He captured men, women, and children. Michele de Cuneo would even write of breastfeeding women with infants being rounded up for the slave markets. In this first round of mass slave raiding, Cuneo would report that Columbus's men eventually managed to ensnare some 1,500 people. 500 of the most hardy-looking were packed into caravels bound for Spain. 600 were given by Columbus as slaves to the remaining colonists in La Isabela, and 400 managed to escape. Now, remember, the Spanish monarchs had commanded Columbus specifically not to do this. But he was desperate to show that Hispaniola was profitable. Even Columbus's most aggrandizing 19th century biographer, the American Washington Irving, would point out that, quote, his constant anxiety was to make wealthy returns to Spain for the purpose of indemnifying the sovereigns for their great expenses, of meeting the public expectations so extravagantly excited, end quote. I mean, there you have it. The public expectations had been extravagantly excited, and now Columbus was willing to throw human misery at the problem. Of those 500 people sent to Europe in this first shipment, only around 300 arrived alive to be auctioned off in a slave market in Seville. But of course, the money made from the sale of those people would only barely meet the expectations of those back in Spain who had been promised the wealth of an island overflowing with gold. So Columbus did everything he could to squeeze every last nugget of gold from the island. To this end, he created his infamous tribute system. Starting in early 1495, Columbus instituted a new directive that every native person on the island over the age of 14 needed to provide the equivalent of one hawk's bell filled with gold every 3 months. Yes, those weirdly specific little trade goods that Columbus had bartered so freely on his first voyage now became a symbol of a truly brutal system of taxation. Again, I'll quote from Washington Irving, who was the author perhaps most responsible for the revival of Columbus's historical reputation in the United States. He writes, quote, "It is a curious circumstance, and might furnish some poetical conceits, that the miseries of the poor natives should thus be measured out, as it were, by the very baubles which first fascinated them." End quote. Yes, Washington Irving, it does furnish some poetical conceits. Larger tributes were demanded from the caciques, who were directed to provide enough gold to fill a calabash, that is, a large gourd used as a jug. People who happened to live in parts of the island where no gold could be found could pay their tribute in the form of 25 pounds of cotton. To keep track of all this, Columbus devised a system whereby indigenous islanders who had paid their tribute were issued a copper token that they were expected to wear around their necks at all times. If you were caught without your copper token, you either needed to pay your tribute right away or face punishment. Now, different sources say different things about what these punishments were. Some sources say that someone who had not paid could expect the death penalty. Bartolomé Las Casas tells us of maimings. He wrote that it was common for people found without their copper token to have their hands cut off, which often proved fatal. Other sources do not speak of severed hands, but do talk about arrests, imprisonments, and other forms of corporal punishment. So yeah, this is the topple the statue stuff. By way of this system, Columbus was able to extract all the gold he could from Hispaniola. But what he learned was that there simply was not all that much gold on the island. After only a few rounds of collections, it became nearly impossible for most people to collect even a hawksbill filled with gold dust. This brings us to one of the more horrible humanitarian disasters I may have ever encountered in my time reading history. At a certain point, the people of the island hit a breaking point. After being hunted as human chattel, now being compelled to labor endlessly sifting gold in the rivers, many islanders despaired and chose to end their own lives. It's been guessed that somewhere around 50,000 islanders chose to die by poisoning themselves, starving themselves to death, or by plunging off of cliffs. Is Christopher Columbus responsible for those deaths? Well, placing blame in the case of a suicide is difficult, but he certainly created a horrible situation. It can be easy to romanticize pre-contact life in the Caribbean as idyllic, even utopian. We need to remember that life on the islands wasn't perfect. There was conflict, there was violence. This was a human society after all. But we shouldn't dismiss just how brutally Columbus had disrupted and transformed life on Hispaniola in just 4 years. 50,000 people decided that they would rather die than live in Columbus's new regime. Now, some Columbus defenders will point out that the admiral did not want the people of Hispaniola to commit suicide. And indeed, his writings seem very concerned with how this wave of deaths would affect harvests, and of course, his ability to collect tribute. Now, I'm sure some of you listening might wonder why the people of Hispaniola didn't rise up, why they didn't fight rather than take their own lives. To that, I will respond that many did rise up. Rebellions against Columbus's regime were extremely common. Many islanders chose a path of violent resistance. Part of the reason that this is sometimes not emphasized has to do with one of our key sources, and that is Bartolomé Las Casas. As I mentioned earlier, Las Casas was a priest who believed that the best thing that could happen in the New World would have been for the indigenous people to have been peacefully converted to Christianity. His depiction of indigenous people is colored by this religious perspective. He often presents the first people of the islands as sinless, perfect children of nature. To him, they are Adam and Eve before the fall, complete with the requisite nudity. As such, he emphasizes their gentleness and speaks less about moments of violent resistance. Now, he was trying to create empathy for a people that were being callously exploited, but his style is such that it can make indigenous people seem helpless and childlike. Now, I'm not saying that Las Casas' histories can't be trusted, just that he has a set of biases that need to be accounted for. It's important to remember that the first people of Hispaniola were people, capable of all the complex emotions that you and I are. On Columbus's Hispaniola, this meant that while many people despaired and took their own lives, others revolted. Some fled to the mountains and joined up with rebellious caciques who were fighting to reclaim their island. But these many rebellions would not dislodge the Spanish. Those captured as prisoners of war were usually enslaved. On top of all of this, the diseases imported to the islands by Europeans began having their own devastating effect on the local people. It's been estimated that at the time of Columbus's arrival, there were around 300,000 indigenous islanders. 100,000 or so died between 1494 and 1496. This was largely before the diseases really started taking their toll. Half of those people died by their own hand. The other half were worked to death, were killed for not gathering enough gold, died as a result of being enslaved, or died in battle fighting the conquerors. In 1508, a census counted only 65,000 indigenous people on the island. By 1548, only 500 Taínos were counted in Hispaniola. You may have read that this indigenous group went extinct, and the horrific levels of death almost support that idea. But this is a different kind of historical myth. To this day, there are people in the Caribbean who can trace their indigenous ancestry back to a time before first contact. The indigenous people of the Caribbean were ravaged, but they did not entirely disappear. Despite the implementation of this horrifically exploitative regime, Hispaniola still only yielded a fraction of the gold that many had expected, given Columbus's account of the first voyage. So, in March of 1496, Columbus decided that it was time for him to return to Spain, where he planned on defending his conduct and hopefully winning royal support for yet another voyage. But this time, Columbus's departure did not mean that the Spanish colonists also left. Hispaniola was now, for better or worse, an established Spanish colony. Columbus could go, but the colony would remain. Of course, Columbus's story would not end there. So let's take one more break, and when we return, I'll do my best to wrap up the last few chapters of Christopher Columbus's life. When Columbus returned to Spain in 1496, he did not receive the same hero's welcome that he had received in 1493. His detractors had done much to hurt his reputation at the Spanish court. And yet, he was still Christopher Columbus, Admiral of the Ocean Sea. Despite the many tales of abuse of power, the monarchs of Spain ultimately remained committed to their Genoese captain. Nevertheless, it would take a solid 2 years before the Spanish monarchs deemed it prudent to give Columbus command of another voyage. Once again, the fate of those left behind was a huge driver in their decision to fund another expedition west. Columbus would head a new fleet, half of which would head directly to Hispaniola to resupply the colonists, and the other half would continue on a mission of exploration to hopefully, finally, find the mainland of Asia. This third voyage would take Columbus to the southern reaches of the Caribbean, where he would encounter the island of Trinidad and the northern shore of what we now know was South America. But on this third voyage, the sources show a Columbus who's becoming ever more mystical and convinced of his messianic destiny. He started referring to himself as the Christ-bearer, a reference to his namesake, Saint Christopher, the saint who, it was said, carried the Christ child across a raging river. Columbus even started signing his name using a strange glyph of his own design, meant to emphasize his status as God's chosen mariner and the Christ-bearer. Now, I bring this up because on the third voyage, Columbus started to perceive geography from a noticeably more mystical religious perspective. While exploring the coast of what is today Venezuela, he started to insist that the fleet had discovered a gateway to paradise. That is literally heaven. There, he came to his final, most deeply wrong conclusion about the shape of planet Earth. The world wasn't round, but instead, according to Columbus, pear-shaped. According to Columbus, the world sloped to a high point, kind of like the top of a pear. Once you were at that high point, you were as close as you could get to heaven. And he believed that he and his crew were getting close to that point while they were off the coast of South America. So, the next time someone says that Columbus proved the world was round, you can say, no, actually, he thought that the world was a weird pear that shot you to heaven. Anyway, after exploring this region for around a month, Columbus then directed his ships back to Hispaniola. There he found his colony once again a chaotic mess. In his absence, Columbus's cartographer brother, Bartolome Columbus, had been in charge. The former mayor of La Isabela, Francisco Roldan, had not appreciated Bartolome's rule and had rebelled. Now, the reasons for Roldan's rebellion are somewhat contested. It was clear that he was tired of a Columbus brother dispensing quote-unquote justice at his discretion. It's sometimes suggested that Roldan and his supporters did not appreciate the limits that were imposed on them when it came to taking advantage of the natives. They did not appreciate occasionally being punished by Bartolome Columbus for going too far in their robberies and sexual assaults. However, there's some reason to doubt this. In Las Casas' history, he describes this as a time when the Spanish were in no way held back from doing whatever they wanted to the local people. Las Casas reported that the colonists would force indigenous slaves to carry them about everywhere in hammocks. He also describes upsetting scenes where the colonists would cut off the arms and legs of indigenous people just for sport. Now, it's possible that Las Casas was exaggerating about these things, but that's what we get from his history. If Las Casas can be trusted, then it seems unlikely that Roldan rebelled to have even more license with the indigenous people. He was also able to get the support of a number of local caciques tired of the rule of the Columbus brothers, which suggests that they were not rebelling exclusively because they wanted to steal more from the local people. Some local people supported them. However, Roldan would eventually lose the support of these caciques once he started his own campaign of enslavement. Bartolome Columbus was no better, as he tried to shore up support on his side of things by promising loyalists indigenous slaves for their continued support. Christopher Columbus's return to Hispaniola would eventually bring an end to Roldan's rebellion. The admiral eventually offered the rebels terms that they could abide by. But by then, many of the caciques were now fully at war with the Spanish colonists. And so, Columbus embarked on a new round of pacifications, military campaigns designed to break the will of the resisting islanders. But while he was engaged on one of these campaigns, in the year 1500, a man by the name of Francisco Bobadilla arrived in Hispaniola. The anti-Columbus faction back in Spain had managed to convince the monarchs that the Columbus brothers needed to be investigated for their abuse of power. Now, I know what you're thinking. Did Christopher Columbus actually face justice for his abuse of the indigenous people of the island? Well, not really. You see, Bobadilla had a vested interest in Columbus's downfall. If Columbus was relieved of his governorship on the island, it would transfer to, guess who, Francisco Bobadilla. So if Bobadilla could make a case that Columbus should be arrested, then he could quietly usurp an entire colony. The charges brought against Columbus did mention his mistreatment of the native people, but those weren't really the bombshell allegations. The more serious charges, at least in the eyes of the Spanish, involved the Columbus brothers, that is, Christopher, Diego, and Bartolome's apparently arbitrary punishments of Spanish colonists, including a group of colonists who had been hanged for various crimes against indigenous islanders. On top of that, there was a whole series of other charges that the Columbus brothers had been hoarding wealth for themselves and had not been sending the monarchs in Spain their fair share of the spoils. All this meant that in September of 1500, Christopher Columbus was arrested and clamped in irons by Bobadilla. He was then sent back to Spain to stand trial for his many perceived wrongs. Bobadilla then handily stepped into the governorship and started his own campaign enslaving and exploiting the local people. Now, this moment, this Columbus in chains moment, is tempting to celebrate if you do not care for him as a historical figure. It seems like a just comeuppance, perhaps. After everything Columbus did to the people of Hispaniola, did he not deserve to be in chains? Sometimes when people are trying to make the case that Columbus was a bad dude, even by the standards of his own day, they will point to this moment. See, Columbus was arrested in 1500 for his abuse of power. But this arrest really wasn't about his system of tribute or his imposition of a slave trade or the wanton abuse of the local people that happened under his watch. It was mostly about Bobadilla usurping the governorship and the perceived wrongs done to the colonists. For his part, Columbus leaned into the martyrdom of this whole thing. He insisted while at sea heading back to Spain that his jailers leave his shackles on him, even though he was told that he could take them off. When he arrived in Spain, he made a big show of presenting his chains to gathered crowds. When he finally had an audience with King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella after a few months in jail, his chains had been removed, but he chose to wear shortened sleeves specifically so the monarchs could see where the shackles had rubbed his skin raw. One source even claims that Columbus requested that he be buried with these chains. Why? Because they were a sign of his persecution, or at least that was how he saw it. This was his crown of thorns. This was his cross to bear. Like the Savior he served, now he, the Christ-bearer, had been betrayed. But, of course, it had all been for the greater glory of God and man. This episode is also deeply unsatisfying because the Spanish monarchs ultimately chose to pardon Columbus after he cried and begged for forgiveness. They even expressed regret for having empowered Bobadilla to relieve him, as they now suspected that he was corrupt and untrustworthy. So, despite his dramatic chaining and imprisonment, Columbus was never properly tried for any crimes real or imagined. However, after this whole debacle, Columbus's deal with the Spanish monarchs was heavily revised. He would be allowed to keep all of his titles, but he would no longer hold any power over the colonies in the Indies. The governorship would be given to a new man. The crown no longer felt obliged to share revenues that had been guaranteed to Columbus in the capitulations of Santa Fe. This issue would eventually lead to Columbus's heirs suing the crown in the years after the mariner's death. Still, despite all of this, Columbus was able to get the monarchs on board to fund one last voyage in 1502. This fourth voyage's stated mission was to hopefully circumnavigate the globe, or the pear, as Columbus insisted. Further, Columbus was given explicit orders not to stop in Hispaniola. This final voyage would prove to be a horrible debacle. Columbus's small fleet would battle seemingly endless storms and other deprivations as they found their way to Central America. They would eventually explore the coast of what are today the nations of Honduras, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, and Panama. But the whole expedition would end in disaster as the fleet was shipwrecked off the coast of Jamaica. There, on a beach on the north coast of Jamaica, Columbus and his often mutinous crew would live as castaways for a solid year before eventually being rescued. While on that beach, Columbus actually pulled one of his wiliest tricks in order to keep the local indigenous people on his side, involving the clever use of a lunar eclipse. But I'm going to save that tale for the extra episode. As my artist and collaborator Frank Fiorentino pointed out to me, this is kind of a Columbus side quest. After this final harrowing journey, Columbus returned to Spain in terrible health. He was more or less blind, could barely walk, and was generally in a huge amount of pain all of the time. His reputation in Spain, while not completely destroyed, was hardly what it had been in 1493. The administration of the Spanish colonies had passed to other men, and the exploits of a new generation of conquistadors were quickly becoming more notable in Spain than anything that had been accomplished by the Genoese foreigner. Columbus would spend the last year of his life stubbornly pursuing the court around Spain, doggedly demanding that the king recognize the many privileges he felt had been unfairly denied him. He would die in 1506, just a year after miraculously surviving his fourth voyage. Contrary to a popular myth, he did not die poor, chained, and in prison. He died still with all his titles intact and living off the many spoils that he had managed to wring out of Hispaniola. He was diminished, but not destitute. From there, it would be the job of historians to decide what to make of Christopher Columbus. In the 16th century, Peter Martyr and Columbus's son Ferdinand would both write overwhelmingly positive appraisals of the man, while Bartolomé Las Casas would write a fairly scathing denunciation of his tenure as the Viceroy of the Indies. For the next few centuries, he became more of a marginal figure, not forgotten, but not necessarily emphasized, especially in majority Protestant countries, where they were loath to celebrate a figure associated with the Spanish. Then, in the late 18th century, this started to change. Independence-minded American colonists started reevaluating the importance of Columbus to the history of their new nation. This reassessment was given its fullest articulation in Washington Irving's hugely popular biography of Columbus, published in 1828. In that book, Irving presented Columbus as one of history's great men and helped cement in the minds of many that medieval people had thought that the world was flat until Columbus bravely proved that it was round. The Columbus that appeared in the Discovery of America sculpture, holding the globe aloft, was Washington Irving's Columbus. And when you read articles today defending the legacy of Columbus, I would argue that it is Washington Irving's Columbus that they are defending. That's the Columbus that people miss. The Columbus they were taught about as kids. The brave Columbus, the world-changing Columbus. I think they're nostalgic for a mythical Columbus. The real Columbus was certainly important. His voyages changed the world, without a doubt. People everywhere should learn about Christopher Columbus. But should we celebrate him? Let me ask you this. What does a person have to do before they're disqualified from having a celebratory statue erected in a public space? I agree that it's unfair to lay all the horrors of colonialism at Columbus's feet. But as I said in the introduction, we can surely judge him on his own decisions. Christopher Columbus personally created a system of slavery in the Caribbean against the wishes of the Spanish monarchs he served. That was all him. Once instituted, indigenous slavery would remain a part of colonial life for decades, until high mortality among indigenous slaves led to the expansion of the African slave trade. Slavery in the New World was not a foregone conclusion until Christopher Columbus forced the issue. The horribly exploitative system of tribute on Hispaniola, well, that was all Columbus. So even those who were not explicitly enslaved were still forced to work lest they be maimed or killed. Columbus disrupted the lives of the people of Hispaniola so dramatically that tens of thousands chose to die rather than live under his regime. When you consider all of that, the fact that he was a talented sailor seems, let's just say less significant. With that said, I empathize with those Italian immigrants who, feeling persecuted and discriminated against in their adopted home of America in the early 20th century, looked around and noticed that Americans were using Christopher Columbus as a symbol of power and legitimacy. I can understand why you might then want to claim that symbol of power for yourself. I can understand why you might want to co-opt this deity in the civic religion and proclaim, "I'll have you know that that man was an Italian." I get it. But they were not celebrating Columbus for being Columbus. They were celebrating Columbus for being Aeneas. And the voyage of Aeneas was fake history. So perhaps it's time we let it go. Okay, that's all for this week. Join us again in 2 weeks' time when we will explore another historical myth. I hope you enjoyed that trilogy on Columbus. That last part was tough. It was tough to get through, but I felt good about how it turned out. Hopefully you really enjoyed it as well. Before we leave this week, of course, I need to give a shout out to the following people. Big ups to Afton Sailor, to Lucas Blight, to David Elliott, to Michael Smith, to Garrett O'Dwyer, to Dayard03, to I don't consent to monthly charges. Good one. To Ryan, to Ashley Chappelle Peoples, to to Eric Riggins, to Rob Steiner, to TSW, to Quinover, to Don Watts, to Mackenzie Parvin, to Jim and Amy Howley, to Liz Grivette, and to Jim Huss. All of these people have decided to pledge at $5 or more every month on Patreon, so you know what that means. They are beautiful human beings. Thank you again for your support, and I'm going to put one more request out there that if you're enjoying the show, please rate and review the show. Give us 5 stars at Apple Podcasts or anywhere else where you can review the show. It helps. If you would like to buy some merchandise, you can always go to our TeePublic store. The easiest way to get there is just to go to ourfakehistory.com and follow the link to the merch store. Or you can go directly to teepublic.com/stores/our-fake-history. All of the art in that store is created by our wonderful resident artist, Frank Fiorentino. I love you, Frank. Keep doing awesome work, dude. As always, the theme music for the show comes to us from Dirty Church. You can check out Dirty Church at dirtychurch.bandcamp.com. And all the other music you heard on the show today was written and recorded by me. My name is Sebastian Major, and remember, just because it didn't happen doesn't mean it isn't real.
At Arizona State University, we're bringing world-class education from our globally acclaimed faculty to you. Earn your degree from the nation's most innovative university. Online. That's a degree better. Learn more at asuonline.asu.edu.